Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's series in our Distinguished Speakers Series. Very, very happy to welcome here the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres. Just over a month from today, the 18th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 8th session of the Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol will be meeting in Doha, Qatar. In Australia and elsewhere, since the disappointment of the 2009 Copenhagen summit, interest in climate change seems to have waned somewhat, with a public rather sceptical that a UN multilateral process will achieve any real results. And of course, our most recent Lowy polling data reflects this waning attitude in Australia, from a very high concern in 2005-2006 to putting climate change and the negotiations on a much lower rank in terms of international policy priorities for the government. Now, our distinguished speaker today, the Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention, is of course closely associated with the global discussions on how the world can achieve a low-carbon future. And she'll be sharing with us today the view that a low-carbon future is a trend which recognises that everyone, every nation, every sector of society holds part of the solution to solving a global problem, and that, in fact, the international climate change negotiations are the intergovernmental face of this global trend towards a low-carbon future. Now, all major economies now have climate change legislation in place with key energy and emissions control components. Businesses around the world have taken the cue as well. Now, how this will play out in Doha, we look forward to hearing from Ms. Figueres today. She was appointed as Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the 17th of May 2010. Ms. Figueres has been involved in climate change negotiations since 1995. She was a member of the Costa Rican negotiating team and represented Latin America and the Caribbean on the Executive Board of the Clean Development Mechanism in 2007, before being elected Vice President of the Bureau of the Conference of the Parties from 2008 to 2009. In 1995, she also founded the Center for Sustainable Development of the Americas, a non-profit think tank for climate change policy and capacity building, which she directed until 2003. Ms. Figueres is a widely published author on the design of climate solutions and has been a frequent advisor to the private sector on how to play a leadership role in mitigation. She holds a master's degree in anthropology from the London School of Economics and a certificate in organisational development from Georgetown University. Before I welcome her to the podium, may I please remind you to turn your mobile phones to silent or to turn them off altogether. There are a lot of you in the room today, which is great to see, but if all your telephones go off at once, that could be rather distracting for our speaker and for our guests today. Please welcome to the podium Ms. Christiana Figueres.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon. Not exactly sure. We're sort of in between. So my first surprise is to see so many of you here, because I did know about the polling results in Australia. And so I was wondering, well, with popular concern waning, how many people are going to be dedicating their very valuable lunchtime to come and listen to something about climate? And I was remembering several years ago, I was asked to give a lecture. I was working in the private sector at the time, and I was asked to give a lecture on a particular technology that we were moving forward at a big congress. And so I went, appointed time, walked in, and there was no one there. And I thought, maybe I got the wrong hall. So I checked. No, it's the right room. So I said, okay. So I went in again, waited for a little bit. One person came in. I said, okay, fine. You know, here I am. I might as well just do this. So I gave, as you can imagine, an abbreviated version of what I was going to say, made my point, and then said to the gentleman, thank you very much. I am leaving now. And he goes, wait, why are you leaving? He goes, well, I'm done, you know, other committees. No, you sit down because I am next in this exact hall. So, thank you for not putting me in that situation today. And I must say, it is ironic that public concern in Australia is waning, public concern about climate change, because if anything, we have increasing evidence that climate change is very much upon us. I don't have to tell you. You know about the flooding events that you've had in Queensland and in Victoria in 2010, 2011, 2012. Combined with drought in other parts of the country. You know about the water scarcity that you've had. You know about the fires that are increasing in intensity and in frequency. So Australia joins other countries in witnessing the increasing effects of climate change. And from a global perspective, it's very, very clear that climate is no longer just an environmental problem for ministries of environment. It's very clear that climate is actually the amplifier and the multiplier of many of the global crises that we are affecting, be they population growth, be they strain on water, be it food scarcity, energy insecurity, you name it. The fact is that if we allow climate change to go unchecked, it could well wipe out all the development that we've had in the past 25 years, in particular, but not only in developing countries. So at the same time, is this a doom and gloom scenario? No, because at the same time, the good news of that is that climate change also represents the greatest opportunity that we have had in decades. Because if we successfully address climate change, we will be accelerating an anyway unavoidable energy revolution, the likes of which we have never seen. So the question that we need to answer is, so are we successfully addressing climate change? And to answer that question, I would like to first confirm a painful fact and then correct two misperceptions. The painful fact that I would like to confirm is that global greenhouse gas emissions keep on rising, that there is no question to the fact that the policy response, whether you measure it nationally or internationally, is way behind what science tells us where we should be. So that is an incontrovertible fact. Now, at the same time, let me correct two misperceptions. And the first is that nothing is happening at the global level to address climate change. Today, being United Nations, I have to stand up for the United Nations, so it won't surprise you that I will. And second misconception that I would like to correct is that at the national level, only Australia is doing something, and it is out there, you know, in the lonely desert, the only country doing something. So let me take one by one. At the global level, well, I'm sure you all read, and some of you may still even feel the pain of Copenhagen. How many still feel the pain of Copenhagen? Okay. Well, we're with you. We're definitely with you. And the press, of course, was quite effective in distributing, disseminating, and amplifying the effects of the Copenhagen conference. What the press has been less effective about is actually communicating in an effective way the fact that the climate change process at the global level has progressed more over the past 3 years than it did over the past 10 years. Now you'll say, well, that's comparing 0 to 0. No, that's not comparing 0 to 0. And let me tell you why. Well, first, we do have a commitment, and I'm going to start small, micro, and then go out. We do have a commitment from all governments that there will be a second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol to start in January of 2013. What governments are still struggling with this year, but they have to finalize that discussion by Doha at the end of this year, is what are the rules going to be for that second commitment period? What are the rules of the game going to be? Not if there's going to be a second commitment period, but how is it going to be applied? So we will have a second commitment period. The good news there is that those are legally binding commitments of some industrialized countries, and that the Kyoto Protocol enshrines the rules and regulations that give that part of the system and the environmental integrity from which we can then draw for the next part and the next chapter of the climate regime. Now, the bad news about the Kyoto Protocol, or specifically about the second commitment period, is that it will only cover 10 to 12% of global emissions. So that is dramatically insufficient. Second step that the governments have made, recognizing that the Kyoto Protocol will only cover a very small amount of emissions, they have then gone forward in Copenhagen and after to put in voluntary pledges of mitigation. So we have all industrialized countries, and I think you know why I underline all industrialized countries have made pledges of how much they are going to reduce by the year 2020, and without any legal or historical responsibility, we already have 49 developing countries that have also come forward and made a public pledge with respect to their mitigation. The good news there is that that covers 80% of global emissions. So now we've gone from 10 to 12 to 80%. Very different nature because the Kyoto Protocol is legally binding and the pledges on the table are voluntary in nature, but we have gone up to 80%. Third step, and you see that this is an ever-expanding circle that governments are working on. Third steps that government took in Durban last year is to say, well, frankly, we need to get from 80 to 100%, and voluntary is not going to be enough. So they undertook to give themselves 3 years to negotiate a new agreement that is going to be applicable to all, with differentiations, of course, but applicable to all, i.e. covering 100% of emissions, and it will be legally based. Exactly what the characteristics of that legal basis are still remains to be seen, but it will be legally based. So you can see that governments are concerned with an ever-expanding circle and scope of coverage of emissions. In the meantime, however, they have also done two very important things. They have, over the past 3 years, built an infrastructure to support developing countries in what they will need to do with respect to both adaptation and mitigation. And there we already have a very ambitious infrastructure that seeks to provide both funding and technology to the developing countries for them to participate in a meaningful way in the global climate change efforts. And second thing the governments have done, recognizing that they are far behind in their policy response, in Durban they also called for an increase in ambition, not in 2015, not in 2020, but immediately. And we will begin to see what that is all about in Doha. So, conclusion to our first misperception that I wanted to clarify is governments are moving forward. They're moving forward admittedly slowly, And I must say, I was not born with patience, and this job is teaching me the virtue of patience, which I'm sure will come in very handy for the rest of my life. But governments are moving forward. Slowly, but they're moving forward at the global level. The second misperception that I wanted to address with you is the thought that only Australia is doing something. Well, nothing could be further from reality. Let me just point out to you that, in fact, every single one of Australia's top trading partners has already some kind of regulation, legislation, carbon price, something already in place. And let me go through some of those examples for you. And of course, we start with the country that we all need to learn the language of because it will control the world in about 2 minutes, China. So China already has a voluntary scheme in place. It has a pilot emissions trading scheme in 7 of the largest cities and regions. And you know, when you say 7 large cities in China, you know what we're talking about. And those will actually move forward into a national trading scheme 5 years from now. Even the pilot schemes that are already in the making, actually, when compared to how much they cover in emissions compared to what the Australian price mechanism covers, it covers 2 times as much emissions as the Australian mechanism. So China is definitely moving forward, let alone recognizing the fact that China is already today the leader in renewable energies. China is number 1 in the world in solar panel manufacturing. China is number 1 in the world in installed wind capacity, number 2 in the world in wind manufacturing, and will soon be number 1. China, when China says they're going to do something, they not only do it, they exceed. They meet and exceed their targets. And under the 12th five-year plan of China, their pledge is to cut their emissions GDP by 40 to 45% below the 2005 level by 2020. You can very much count on China actually meeting and exceeding that. The United States, that we all like to pound on, the United States does have a voluntary pledge of 17% reduction below 2005 levels by 2020. It is buttressed not by legislation, because there is no political public support for that yet. Let's see what happens after November 6th. But it is buttressed by regulation on both the power sector and the transportation sector in the United States. And we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and the California scheme that are already moving forward with emissions trading in the United States. Just about 3 hours ago, I just arrived from Korea. Very impressive. Korea is taking an indisputable leadership position in what they call green growth. Just yesterday, before we left, they inaugurated their GGGI, try to say that, Global Green Growth Institute, that is leading the way not only in being the think tank and the analysis center for Korea's green growth, but actually reaching out to other countries that are interested in accelerating the transformation and helping them to do that. Korea has a national pledge of 30% reduction under its business as usual. The European Union, you all know, that is the most well-established emissions trading scheme, covering 40% of their emissions, and they have a target of 21% below. India, trading planned for 2014, also with an impressive reduction target. Singapore. I was just in Singapore before Korea. You see, I collect countries that are actually leading. on climate. Singapore, a very, very impressive, tiny. Singapore is 710 square kilometers, okay? It is a city-state, a low-lying city-state. It has no viable renewable energy, none. It is an island, but they don't have enough sun. They don't have wind. They don't have enough tide to have tide energy. They have no viable renewable energy whatsoever. Despite that, Singapore has taken a pledge of 7 to 11% reduction by 2020 and going all the way up to 16 if everybody else is playing the game. New Zealand already launched in 2010 its target. Thailand is moving forward with a voluntary market. And I could go on and on and on. My point is, all of these countries are having a very interesting, or choosing a very interesting mix. Some of them with laws, with regulation, with legislation, with carbon pricing, with feed-in tariffs, with energy efficiency, incentives, you name it. Some of them do all of them, some of them choose. The point is that they are choosing the particular mix that optimizes their specific national circumstances. Now, you might ask yourself, so why are all of these countries acting on climate change? Well, much as on Today UN Day, I would love to say, well, all of these countries are trying to save the planet. Let me be very honest with you. None of them is trying to save the planet. That's not why they're doing this. They will also help to save the planet, but that's sort of the cherry on the cake, okay? They are doing this because it is in their national interest. And that is the most powerful motivator. They're doing it because of energy security, because of balance of trade in the case of those who don't have fossil fuel on their own territory, because of local health, and above all, because of the competitiveness that they want to either gain or maintain in the low carbon economy that we know is coming down the pike. The fact is that this understanding of the national interest on working on climate change has actually progressed very rapidly, particularly since our very beloved Copenhagen conference. A few years ago, the feeling was, well, you know, working on climate, it's a long-term global interest, doesn't really have anything to do with us as a nation, as a community, as a society. It's my children's and their children's and 7 generations down, and we can't really do anything. Well, the fact is that as the energy revolution has gathered momentum, countries have really realized that it is in their short-term national interest to act on climate change. So we are moving quite quickly from the predominant paradigm that we had just a few years ago of you first. There's a small little door, no, you first. Everybody's been very cordial. Please do move through the door first, and then we'll follow. We're moving from the you first paradigm to the first mover paradigm, which is motivated by self-national interest. The interesting thing about that is that as countries move in their own national interest, they're actually at the same time opening the political space for a future global agreement. So by working on their own self-national interests, they're working indirectly but quite powerfully on the global interest. And the consequence of this is that the most powerful realization that we've had over the past few years is that climate change is not going to be solved only top-down, which was the theory that we had in Copenhagen and was smashed pretty effectively. And it's also not going to be only a bottom-up solution. It is going to be the combination of the two. And in fact, it is going to be the concurrent efforts that reinforce each other and spiral up toward the transformation that we all know is coming. So to those wonderful Australians who have pangs of loneliness out there in the desert, we're the only ones doing something. I really say very, very clearly Australia is not alone in acting on climate change. In fact, Australia is a major player and an emerging leader. To the major player, let us just accept the fact that Australia is the largest per capita emitter among developed countries. That's just a fact. And it is the 15th largest emitter in aggregate. So Australia has something to say about this. The success that Australia is going to have really depends on focusing very, very clearly on what is Australia's self-interest. And there I would point out two areas that strike me. First, to jumpstart the national economic transformation that is coming, will come at a global level, at a time in which the costs are still manageable and the benefits foreseeable. And secondly, to position Australia, a country blessed with renewable energy capacity, to position Australia as a technology provider for that economy that is coming, stimulating job growth and harnessing economic development opportunities in growth sectors. Now, as Australia pursues those national interests, at the same time, I must say, Australia's pursuit of their national interest also has global impacts, because it allows Australia to integrate competitively with those countries that are already acting. It allows Australia to encourage those that are lagging, to give a stronger position that really helps shape the response, and finally, to strengthen the global response to tackle climate change. Australia is dealing here with both its influence on the national level, on the international level, and the effectiveness of its clean energy future policy. And it is very clear that the effectiveness of its international influence will be highly determined by the success that it has in the clean energy future policy. So it's not surprising that the world is looking very closely to see how Australia succeeds, progresses and succeeds with its clean energy policy. Now, I would not be able to sit down if I didn't bring up one more issue, and that is Australia's participation in the Kyoto Protocol. I would not be true to myself if I didn't call your attention to the fact that the national and the global levels of action for Australia, but for any other country, are intimately linked. So while I fully respect the fact that the Australian government is still considering its participation in the Kyoto Protocol, let me make a couple of points about that. Number one, Australia, as we know, is already very vulnerable to climate change. And no matter how fantastic the clean energy future policy is, climate cannot be solved by Australia alone. If Australia wants to mitigate the impacts, the negative impacts of climate change, it needs to join those countries that are aggressively working on climate change. So, A, for good company's sake, and to really bring about the global solution that needs to occur. Secondly, Australia, through its clean energy policy, has already positioned itself very, very wisely for the Kyoto Protocol. Already. And thirdly, having done that, having positioned itself so well for the Kyoto Protocol, I would not understand why Australia wouldn't want to benefit from the international recognition that would come from taking the same national resolve to the international level through the Kyoto Protocol. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude, not just by challenging Australia. You'll have to know I never ever give a public speech without challenging the audience, and actually, considering everything that Australia is doing, my challenge to you is quite quite pale because I can challenge people much more vigorously than that. But let me finish by congratulating Australia for its really very visionary clean energy future policy that will contribute to making low carbon living the norm and not the novelty that it is now. And I congratulate Australia for joining its major trade partners in ushering in a global low carbon reality, which ultimately, my dear friends, is the only reliable reality that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Figueres, and I'm afraid you can't quite sit down yet because you have generously agreed to answer questions from the audience. And I'm reminded of a former Prime Minister who, in this very room, talked about climate change being the moral challenge of our times. That did not, or the great moral challenge of our times, that in the end didn't help him a great deal. But what you've talked about here really is that it's an economic challenge.
And the two are not mutually exclusive.
And the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but you are very much talking about interests and economic challenges, which, of course, go to the very heart of what politicians talk about, particularly when they're going for re-election. And I noticed, by the way, in that context, and I will take speaker's privilege first, a factoid that one of my colleagues reminded me of as we were coming down the stairs is that for the very first time since 1984, the question of climate change was not the subject in the presidential debate.
In the US.
In the US. And so I'm wondering, given the fact that there is still an expectation that the US would play a considerable role both nationally and internationally, whether you think that is a good or a negative signal for the future negotiations.
You know, I was educated in the United States, at least part of my education, thank God not all of it. Part of my education was in the United States, and I am so confounded because at least while I was there, and admittedly this was decades ago, science did play a role in education. And so I am increasingly confounded by the United States, and here's the part that I find most puzzling. Why would the United States, having the technology capacity that it has, why would it want to allow China to be the first in renewable energy? Because we all know that we're going toward renewable energy. We all know that. So why would it allow China to have that advantage? And that is something that I don't understand, and that I'm sure both candidates are grappling with. The fact is, you know, on November 7th, nothing is going to change the fact that the United States government, whoever sits in the White House, will have to tackle climate change, will have to figure out how is the United States going to participate, and in particular, will have to figure out how is the United States not going to be left behind. So whether they talk about it now or not, if it's a taboo subject for the election, well, so be it. That doesn't change the fact that they're going to have to face it.
Might be an advantage. Okay, the gentleman here, we have two questions over here, then here, then here. So we have four people. The man with the red tie. Please identify yourself. Please take the microphone.
Oh, thank you.
Identify yourselves and then ask a question.
Christiana, Ian McGregor from University of Technology, Sydney Business School. I was impressed among your very impressive background, you're advising the private sector in playing a leadership role in climate change.
I was.
Yes, but the question is what is happening now? Big corporate emitters, coal-fired electricity generators, coal miners, oil companies are still blocking many countries, and I would say that's the problem in the US, from moving quickly to address climate change at a national and international level. How do we stop powerful private interests from blocking governments, such as US, Canada, Russia, Japan, and to some extent Australia, from committing to serious action nationally and internationally to address climate change?
Well, the first thing is that there is no such thing as the private sector. many versions of the private sector. And just to put out the two extremes, there are companies, I call them the incumbents, that of course feel that they would be the losers in this battle. And there are companies, very visionary companies, that understand that they have a lot to gain and that have, as a whole, already invested $1 trillion into renewable energy. What is interesting is to see what is happening with the incumbents, because we have, just over the last month, read very interesting announcements from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is now saying, well, where does everybody go to pray in Saudi Arabia?
Mecca.
And guess what city they want to turn 100% solar? Well, independently, I actually haven't gone to figure out how many, what megawatt does that take. But think of the symbol of that, okay? Everybody in Saudi Arabia and in the Arab world goes to pray in Mecca. Just think of this symbol of turning Mecca into a 100% solar city. Not only that, yesterday or the day before, I've lost track of time, we also heard from Saudi Arabia that they have really understood that fossil fuels are going to continue to play a role, but they will not be the predominant growth fuel of the future. They understand that their resources are limited, and they are going to change the application of their oil to put it into polymers and into much higher value application, and keep their oil for those high value application and then substitute. They're completely wasting their oil on electricity, because you can produce electricity with many other things. That is the kind of transformation coming from Saudi Arabia. If you understand that if that comes from Saudi Arabia, that is going to trickle through to the incumbents very, very quickly. So my friends, I think we're in for a lot of good news.
Harley Wright from Climate Sense, promoting contraction and convergence. I was delighted you put Australia on the spot for not yet having signed up to Kyoto Phase 2. I'm delighted you reminded me, and my emails will be running hot tonight. But you've given us a wonderful picture, both sweet and sour, of how things are progressing, and I'm frustrated, very frustrated, at the speed at which UNFCCC is moving forwards.
Who do you think is more frustrated, you or me?
I'm delighted to hear you're frustrated. I share your passion for getting carbon down. It is very frustrating. But I see the COP process moving in increments of very small steps, whereas in Australia we have carbon abatement, and it was built on a major report, Garneau's Climate Change Review, and that was the basis for our legislation. He analysed the options, how to do it efficiently, how to do it fairly. And I don't understand, I haven't seen from the UNFCCC a major report of how you get to the end game. The end game is at least 80% cuts in emissions by 2050. It's easy. That's easy as a target, as a physical target. But at the rate we're going to fail. We're going to go over 2 degrees. So we need something new. Why can't the UNFCCC have a major report like that with options that address the different wants at different ends of the spectrum, and let COP then discuss the options and agree on something quickly, strongly, and get something out? Commission consultants to
the answer
report.
Music to consultants' ears.
Should we take several questions and then
I've got a question here and there and then here. Oh, sorry, I think you were first. Sorry, just the gentleman in the centre here. No, never mind. It's wait a minute, please. We can't hear you if you don't speak into the microphone. Helps if it's on. Yeah.
Ween Ocean Nourishment Corporation. I'd have to say, as an Australian, I remain embarrassed to be an Australian because of our performance in this space.
In this beautiful country?
Yes, in this space only. I love Australia. Not as embarrassed as I used to be, I'd have to say. But we have the skills, we have the knowledge, we have the education to export and set a real leadership example in this space. You know, we have a very large ocean and land mass, and we underutilise it in terms of what it could be doing for us, particularly in the space of blue carbon. We really seem to now, if we turn to the world stage, seem to have lost sight of the certified emission reduction part of this mechanism for carbon trading and carbon credits. And because they're the most socially responsible of the particular types of emission reductions and credits, I'm wondering whether we should just refocus the emphasis. As all these countries are doing their own thing, they're not looking at the global problem, and maybe CERs can help a bit more.
We'll take one more question before I ask you to respond, and the gentleman here, and then you're next.
Thank you. John Allen. How do we address what I think is the major issue, that China's increasing energy needs will continue to rely on approximately 70% of its production from coal? I mean, they may be the leaders in the renewable energy space, but that's addressing the growth in their energy needs, not necessarily the underlying foundation. And to me, that's the elephant in the room.
Thank you.
One more?
If you like, we can take one more, just over here then.
Thank you very much for speaking today. Margie Thompson, Cement Industry Federation in Australia. I'd like to ask a question that's probably a lead up from a previous question as well. In the CDM market, what role will it play in the future, and how should Australia participate in that over time?
Okay, thanks. Let me combine the two CDM questions. As I understand it, the clean energy future policy and the price mechanism in Australia is going to, as it should, request 50% of the emission reductions coming domestically, 50% internationally, and 12.5 of that is going to be CERs. So there is a wedge, if you will, there reserved for CERs from the clean development mechanism. So I do think that Australia is still very aware of the fact that those CERs do represent, from developing countries, the most environmentally, the highest environmental integrity mitigation options from developing countries. So that's why I believe that 12.5 there is reserved. The CDM, well, it's very clear that the CDM market is in a valley, is in a dip. I was asked the other day when I was at Chatham House, so do you think that this is the end of, some dramatic, I can't remember what they said, some dramatic something about the CDM? No, I don't believe that this is the end of the CDM at all. In fact, we as Secretariat are actually investing in several areas in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, investing into helping the smaller countries that are not represented yet in the CDM to build up their capacity to join the market. Yes, the market is in a dip. It has nothing to do with supply. It has to do with demand. There is no demand right now because the major demand would come from the European Union, and the European Union has restricted how much it's going to buy from the CDM market. So as we see things progressing, as we see more participants in the Kyoto Protocol's second commitment period, B, as we see more of these emission trading schemes, of which I have only given you some, I didn't give you the full list of emerging emission trading schemes, it is only to be understood that all of these emission trading schemes, while they are starting as little mushrooms in a forest, eventually they're going to have to be linked, because you have to be able to know if a ton in India is the same in a ton in China, and a ton in Korea, and a ton in Australia. So all of those markets will have to be linked, and the CDM will be a part of that linkage. Not a monopoly market anymore as it was over the past, but it will be a part of those linked markets. China. Yes, China has a huge coal capacity. They're currently building 3 coal plants per week, and their projection is that they're going to go down to 1 coal plant a week, because they fully understand that they cannot continue to rely as much as they have in the past on coal. And they have this very impressive reduction of energy intensity or carbon intensity per GDP. China is, of course, one of the countries that has to continue to grow if it's going to bring its population out of poverty. China and India have to continue to grow. And the huge challenge for them is, how do they grow? How do they bring their population out of poverty? How do they pursue the economic growth that they have to and that they're entitled to, while not continuing to have the same profile of greenhouse gas emissions that we have seen over the past 150 years in the north? How do they decouple? So they need to continue to grow their economic growth, but they need to decouple their greenhouse gas emissions, something that Mexico has already done. The 5th National Communications of Mexico already proves that Mexico has decoupled, and it's probably the first developed country to be able to decouple, and I dare say it will not be the last. And the UNFCCC, well, the answer to your question is quite simple, because it's not our mandate. Our mandate is to support the negotiations among governments to come to ever increasingly ambitious agreements with each other. However, our cousins across the street, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, does do the kind of report that you are talking about, and they are currently working on their 5th assessment report, the first chapter of which will come out in June of next year. And they do go through first the science of where we are on greenhouse gas emissions, and also on vulnerability, and they go through the vulnerability, and they go through the mitigation options, and they identify several scenarios, quite a few scenarios, for mitigation for stabilizing greenhouse gases. So if you want to look at the one that exists right now, it would be the 4th assessment report, but the 5th assessment report of the IPCC is up and coming.
Okay, we have here and here and here. You could come to the front. Gentleman here. Please put your hand up clearly so we can see him.
Thank you. My name is Pavel Vanishkin. I work for the Russian News Agency TASS. I've got a question about
the Russian
News Agency TASS, TASS. Okay. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about nuclear energy? Is it the viable alternative in this future world? It doesn't have any green emission gas problems. What do you personally think about it? Do you like it? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, and
let's ask Fukushima.
And then the lady here on the right, and then you.
Hi, my name is Natasha. I'm from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. Thank you for always being so supportive of the youth constituency at the UNFCCC process. We appreciate you dancing with us when we ask you to. I guess I wanted to ask, what do you personally think is the most effective way for A, young people to engage in Australia with the negotiations, and B, as part of the official youth constituency at the negotiations?
Thank you. And let me help you.
I'm Sam, and I'm with OICC too. I wanted to know how much capacity you thought Australia had to change some of the views of the other countries within the umbrella group on signing on to the 2nd phase of Kyoto Protocol, as we're the chair of that.
Thank you. And we seem to like 4 questions. Anyone else like to ask a question to make it 4? Yes, the gentleman here.
Howard, just a private citizen. This might be more a question for the IPCC than
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
This might be more a question for someone from the IPC than for yourself, but Your key question was, are we successfully addressing climate change? So my question relates to timeliness. The laws of nature don't negotiate or compromise, and unlike you, they will not learn patience. So with our current progress of negotiation and discussions in reducing emissions, how bad are climate events likely to get before we start to reduce the overall problem?
Nuclear. Well, of course, the story of nuclear BF and after B is before Fukushima, and after Fukushima is a very different story. It is clear that nuclear certainly doesn't have any greenhouse gas emissions, but has other very, very serious environmental consequences and dangers. And so those countries that will continue to rely on nuclear for part of their generation are already embarking on reviewing all of their nuclear plants for their safety and whatever retrofitting they need to do. And what this is going to cause is an increased cost in nuclear as we move forward, which means it will probably delay the planned entry of nuclear. So the quick answer is probably will remain one of the generation sources, but needs an impressive amount of additional capital to deal with the dangers that we've seen in Fukushima. Young people, my answer is the usual. I always welcome you to the COP, as you know. And I think your participation in the COP, the value of your participation in the COP is the networking that you can do with other young people and with other constituencies that are at the COP. And you do that extraordinarily well. My request to you has always been that in addition to doing that, that you look for opportunities to have the conversation that you would like to have at home, because every single delegation gets to the COP with a collar, as I call it, of a position. They know what their entry is and they know how much they can go off. And they can't move from that. So you really need to have that conversation at home. And I am certain that, that in putting forward the clean energy policy in Australia, there is a constant reach out to the various constituencies to really get a consensus as to how Australia can continue to move forward. On CP2, yes, Australia is the chair, has done, I would say, an extraordinary job as chair of the umbrella group. It is not an easy group to chair. I certainly would not want to be in Australia's shoes. But here is the important thing to remember. Every country needs to make these decisions on their own. Every country needs to understand what their national circumstances are, what their risks and vulnerabilities are, what their opportunities are, and how do they optimize that for their own self-interest. There is no such thing as one country putting a pistol to another country's head and saying, you must. It just doesn't happen that way. That's not the way the UN works. Every country needs to understand this. So the best leadership that Australia can and is doing is actually to implement their clean energy policy at home, because that is the best way to show. And here's the difficulty. The umbrella group, yes, but more importantly, developing countries who are under more pressure than developed countries, because developed countries already have the economic development that they need. The developing countries, because they have this huge economic development need, are desperately looking around for models. Who has done this? Please show me a country that has pursued climate change policies aggressively and has maintained or increased its economic growth. And currently, we have a couple of sectors, isolated examples in sectors and countries, but we do not have examples of national economic transformation. Those are the kinds of models that everybody's looking for. So Australia here has a huge opportunity, together with Korea, because Korea is doing very much the same, to be a model for industrialized and for developing countries as to how can you do this. How bad is it going to get? You know what? It could get so bad. It could get so bad that we could go beyond an environmental tipping point, beyond which no national country will be able to be stable. None. Now, I don't even want to think about that scenario because we just simply cannot get there. We don't have another option but to solve this problem. When people ask me, so what's plan B? If the UNFCCC doesn't move forward, what's plan B? Well, there is no plan B because we don't have a planet B. We've got to solve this. And, you know, all the doom and gloom scenarios that you put out there, frankly, they don't impress me. What impresses me is the courageous leadership of countries that understand, here's an opportunity, here's a concern, I can bring them both together and I can move forward.
Well, I think that's a very good place on which to conclude this. I think this has been a terrific exchange. So thank you very much, first of all, for coming here and speaking to us, spending time with us, and also for engaging wonderfully with the audience and answering their questions and discussing things with them. It's been a terrific afternoon. So I want to thank you very much for coming and talking to us, for engaging with us. I want to wish you all the best for the rest of your time in Australia, and of course in a month's time, all the very, very best for Doha.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
2006 to putting climate change and the negotiations on a much lower rank in terms of international policy priorities for the government. Now, our distinguished speaker today, the Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention, is of course closely associated with the global discussions on how the world can achieve a low-carbon future, and she'll be sharing with us today the view that a low-carbon future is a trend which recognises that everyone, every nation, every sector of society holds part of the solution to solving a global problem, and that, in fact, the international climate change negotiations are the intergovernmental face of this global trend towards a low-carbon future. Now, all major economies now have climate change legislation in place with key energy and emissions control components. Businesses around the world have taken the cue as well. Now, how this will play out in Doha, we look forward to hearing from Ms. Figueres today. She was appointed as Executive Secretary of the Framework Convention by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the 17th of May 2010. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's series in our Distinguished Speakers Series. Very, very happy to welcome here the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres. Just over a month from today, the 18th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 8th session of the Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol will be meeting in Doha, Qatar. In Australia and elsewhere, since the disappointment of the 2009 Copenhagen summit, interest in climate change seems to have waned somewhat, with a public rather sceptical that a UN multilateral process will achieve any real results. And of course, our most recent Lowy polling data reflects this waning attitude in Australia from a very high concern in 2005. But if all your telephones go off at once, that could be rather distracting for our speaker and for our guests today. Please welcome to the podium Ms. Christiana Figueres.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon. Not exactly sure. We're sort of in between. So my first surprise is to see so many of you here, because I did know about the polling results in Australia. And so I was wondering, well, with popular concern waning, how many people are going to be dedicating their very valuable lunchtime to come and listen to something about climate. And I was remembering several years ago, I was asked to give a lecture. I was working in the private sector at the time, and I was asked to give a lecture on a particular technology that we were moving forward at a big congress. And so I went, appointed time, walked in.
Ms. Figueres has been involved in climate change negotiations since 1995. She was a member of the Costa Rican negotiating team and represented Latin America and the Caribbean on the executive board of the Clean Development Mechanism in 2007, before being elected Vice President of the Bureau of the Conference of the Parties from 2008 to 2009. In 1995, she also founded the Center for Sustainable Development of the Americas, a non-profit think tank for climate change policy and capacity building, which she directed until 2003. Ms. Figueres is a widely published author on the design of climate solutions and has been a frequent advisor to the private sector on how to play a leadership role in mitigation. She holds a master's degree in anthropology from the London School of Economics and a certificate in organisational development from Georgetown University. Before I welcome her to the podium, may I please remind you to turn your mobile phones to silent or to turn them off altogether. There are a lot of you in the room today, which is great to see.
There was no one there. And I thought, maybe I got the wrong hall. So I checked, no, it's the right room. So I said, okay. So I went in again, waited for a little bit. One person came in. I said, okay, fine. You know, here I am. I might as well just do this. So I gave, as you can imagine, an abbreviated version of what I was going to say, made my point, and then said to the gentleman, thank you very much, I am leaving now. And he goes, well, wait, why are you leaving? He goes, well, I'm done, you know, other commitments. No, you sit down because I am next in this exact hall. So, thank you for not putting me in that situation today. And I must say, it is ironic that public concern in Australia is waning, public concern about climate change, because